January 3, 2026. Caracas was still asleep. A humid pre-dawn haze hung over the city, the air thick with diesel fumes and distant ocean salt. The only sound was the low mechanical hum of helicopters cutting through the darkness, flying low so low their rotors rattled windows in the presidential district. Within minutes, the silence broke. Boots struck pavement. Steel doors were breached. Armed men moved with practiced precision through marble corridors built for ceremony, not war. By sunrise, Nicolás Maduro, the sitting president of Venezuela, was no longer in his palace. He was no longer in his country. He was in the air, restrained, sedated, and bound for the United States. Washington would later call it a law enforcement operation, a necessary action to combat terrorism, drug trafficking, and corruption. But beyond official statements, beyond press conferences and legal language, another reality settled in across the world's capitals. This wasn't an arrest. It was an invasion. And it wasn't about drugs. It wasn't about democracy. It was about oil. And the system that has governed global power for over half a century, the petrodollar. This was the paradox at the heart of the operation. In trying to save the dollar-based global system, the United States may have exposed and fatally weakened it. Venezuela is not just another oil producer. It holds the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, over 303 billion barrels. More than Saudi Arabia. More than Russia. More than Iraq. For decades, that oil was sold in U.S. dollars, reinforcing a system created in the 1970s when the world agreed formally and informally that oil would be priced, traded, and settled in dollars. That agreement did more than stabilize energy markets. It turned the U.S. dollar into the backbone of global finance. Every country needed dollars. Every country needed access to the system. And every country that challenged it eventually faced consequences. By the early 2000s, Venezuela began asking questions no oil state was supposed to ask. Why must oil be sold only in dollars? Why should financial sovereignty be surrendered to one currency, one system, one power? Those questions would echo for nearly 3 decades. And in January 2026, they would be answered by force. What made Venezuela different was not just that it left the dollar system. It tried to prove others could leave too. China was watching. Russia was watching. Saudi Arabia was watching. Because once the world saw a sitting president removed for abandoning the dollar, the illusion was gone. The petrodollar was no longer a voluntary system. It was enforcement. And when enforcement becomes visible, systems don't strengthen. They fracture. This story is not about villains and heroes. It is about incentives, structures, and power. It is about how a financial system built to create stability became dependent on coercion, and what happens when that coercion is exposed. To understand how the invasion of Venezuela became a turning point in global finance, we must go back, not to 2026, but to a moment decades earlier, when a former paratrooper stood before a cheering crowd and promised to change the rules. The question no one was supposed to ask, 1999 to 2001. In 1999, Hugo Chavez was elected president of Venezuela. His rise was not sudden. It was the product of decades of inequality in one of the world's richest resource nations. Chavez inherited a paradoxical country, immense oil wealth, and widespread poverty. Early in his presidency, Chavez asked a question that unnerved Washington and Wall Street alike. Why should Venezuela, sovereign, resource-rich, independent, depend on a foreign currency to sell its own oil? In 2001, Chavez passed a new hydrocarbons law. It mandated majority state control over oil projects. U.S. oil companies were given a choice: comply or leave. Most left. The message was clear. Venezuela intended to reclaim its energy sovereignty. Barter, alliances, and red lines, 2000 to 2008. In 2000, Chavez traveled to Iraq, then under heavy U.S. sanctions, and proposed oil for goods exchanges. No dollars. No banks. No intermediaries. Soon after, Venezuela expanded oil for loans agreements with China, eventually totaling over $60 billion, repaid entirely in oil. With Cuba, Oil was exchanged for doctors and teachers. With Iran, machinery and fuel swapped directly. With Russia, military hardware for energy contracts. Each deal bypassed the dollar. In 2007, Venezuela withdrew from the IMF and World Bank, calling them instruments of U.S. control. All debts were paid off. Leverage was removed. By 2008, Chavez openly called for the end of the petrodollar at the United Nations, proposing alternative reserve currencies and regional monetary systems. For the first time, an oil state wasn't just defecting, it was organizing. Regime pressure without invasion, 2002 to 2013. The U.S. response was layered. A failed coup in 2002 briefly removed Chavez. A recall referendum in 2004 failed. Economic pressure intensified. When Chavez died in 2013, many expected reversal. Instead, Nicolás Maduro continued the same strategy: de-dollarization, multipolar alliances, and state control of oil. Economic siege, 2015 to 2020. In 2015, the U.S. formally declared Venezuela a national security threat. Sanctions followed. By 2017, $13.7 billion in annual oil revenue vanished overnight. $7 billion in assets frozen. Insurance, shipping, and finance blocked. Spare parts banned. Venezuela's oil production collapsed, not from lack of oil, but lack of access. Sanctions replaced invasion. Until they didn't. The invasion as financial signal, 2026. When sanctions failed to reverse policy, the final tool was used. The invasion of Venezuela was not about immediate control of oil fields. It was about example. A warning written in action. This is the cost of leaving the dollar system. But the message landed differently than intended. Instead of fear, it created clarity. The petrodollar was not protected by trust. It was protected by force. And once force is revealed, alternatives accelerate. By the time the helicopters left Caracas and the world absorbed what had happened, something irreversible had already changed. Not in Venezuela alone, not even in the United States, but in the collective understanding of how global power truly works. For decades, the petrodollar system survived not because it was written into law, but because it felt invisible, natural, almost inevitable. Oil was priced in dollars because that's how the world worked. Nations held dollar reserves because that's what stability required. Financial flows moved through American institutions because there was no alternative that matched their scale, liquidity, or reach. Or so it seemed. The events surrounding Venezuela shattered that illusion. What the invasion revealed, more clearly than any academic paper or diplomatic leak ever could, was that the dollar-based system is not merely economic. It is geopolitical, strategic, and, when necessary, enforced. This is not a moral judgment. It is a structural reality. Every dominant monetary system in history has rested on power as much as trust. The Roman denarius, the Spanish silver real, the British pound. Each thrived while the empire behind it could project authority. What made the U.S. dollar different was subtlety. Its dominance felt consensual, market-driven, mutually beneficial. Venezuela exposed the mechanism beneath the surface. When a nation with the largest oil reserves on earth attempted to operate outside the dollar system, and to encourage others to do the same, the response escalated step by step. Political pressure, economic warfare, financial isolation, and finally, direct force. That progression matters, because it teaches every other country a lesson that can no longer be ignored. The petrodollar is not protected by agreement alone. It is protected by consequences. And once that is understood, rational actors begin to adapt. China did not need to issue a press release condemning the invasion to grasp its meaning. Nor did Saudi Arabia need to publicly denounce Washington to internalize the signal. States do not respond to rhetoric. They respond to incentives and risks. The risk was now visible. If Venezuela could be sanctioned, strangled, and ultimately invaded for bypassing the dollar, then no oil-producing nation was immune. Size did not guarantee safety. Reserves did not guarantee leverage. Even long-standing relationships did not guarantee restraint. The logical response was not defiance, but preparation. Diversify reserves. Experiment with alternative settlement systems. Reduce exposure quietly, gradually, methodically. Not because the dollar suddenly lost all value, but because reliance on a single enforced system had become strategically dangerous. This is how global transitions actually begin, not with declarations, but with hedging. The irony is difficult to ignore. The invasion intended to defend the dollar's centrality ended up clarifying its vulnerability. By making enforcement visible, it stripped the system of its most valuable asset, perceived neutrality. For years, critics of the petrodollar argued it was a tool of American power. Supporters countered that it was simply efficient, that markets chose the dollar because it worked better than any alternative. Venezuela made that debate obsolete. When power must intervene to preserve a system, efficiency is no longer the sole explanation. And when enforcement becomes obvious, trust begins to erode. This erosion does not happen overnight. Financial systems rarely collapse in dramatic moments. They decay, shift, and reconfigure over years or decades. But every transformation has an inflection point, a moment historians later identify as the beginning of the end. For many, January 2026 will be remembered as one of those moments, not because the dollar collapsed that day, but because the world stopped pretending the system was voluntary. The deeper lesson of Venezuela is not about oil alone. It is about what happens when financial architecture and military power become indistinguishable. In the short term, force can compel compliance. In the long term, it inspires alternatives. History is consistent on this point. The British pound did not lose its dominance because Britain was defeated militarily. It lost dominance because the costs of maintaining its global system exceeded the benefits, and other nations began to build parallel structures. The same dynamic now unfolds. China's yuan does not need to replace the dollar tomorrow to matter. It only needs to exist as an option. Regional settlement systems do not need to overthrow global finance. They only need to reduce dependence. Each bilateral trade settled outside the dollar is insignificant on its own. But collectively, they represent a shift in psychology. And psychology is everything in monetary systems. Money functions because people believe in it. Reserve currencies function because nations believe they are safer inside the system than outside it. Venezuela reversed that calculation. By demonstrating the cost of exit, it also demonstrated the cost of staying. This is the paradox at the heart of the story. The United States did not act irrationally. From a strategic perspective, defending the petrodollar makes sense. It underpins borrowing power, military reach, and global influence. Allowing a major oil producer to openly defect and recruit others would have set a dangerous precedent. But by acting decisively and visibly, the U.S. revealed the system's dependence on coercion rather than consent. And that revelation cannot be undone. In the months following the invasion, financial headlines focused on surface-level indicators: oil prices, currency fluctuations, diplomatic statements. But beneath those metrics, something quieter was happening. Central banks adjusted portfolios. Sovereign wealth funds reassessed exposure. Trade ministries explored contingency frameworks. None of this required dramatic announcements. In fact, discretion was the strategy. Because the lesson of Venezuela was not that resistance must be loud. It was that survival requires subtlety. The world did not unite against the dollar. It simply began planning for a future where the dollar is no longer singular. And that distinction matters. This is not a story of collapse. It is a story of transition. A system born in the aftermath of World War II, solidified in the 1970s, and enforced in the 21st century, is now entering its most uncertain phase. Not because it failed, but because it succeeded for too long. The very dominance that made the dollar indispensable also made it vulnerable to overextension. When every challenge is treated as existential, every response becomes heavier, costlier, and more visible. Venezuela was not the cause of de-dollarization. It was the confirmation. For decades, economists debated whether the dollar's dominance could ever be challenged. After Venezuela, the question changed. Not if, but how fast. And here lies the final, uncomfortable truth. Systems rarely fall when they are weak. They fall when they reveal how strong they must be to survive. The invasion of Venezuela will not be remembered primarily for its immediate outcomes. It will be remembered for what it exposed. That beneath the language of markets and rules lies power. That beneath stability lies enforcement. And that beneath the global financial order lies a choice every nation must eventually confront. Submit, adapt, or build something new. Venezuela chose to build something new and paid the price. But in doing so, it forced the world to see the system clearly. And once clarity replaces illusion, history begins to move. The petrodollar still stands. The dollar still dominates. The system still functions. But it no longer hides. And that may be the most consequential change of all. Because when a system is understood, not just used, it enters its final stage. Not collapse, but transformation. And the world is now watching, calculating, and quietly preparing for what comes next.